Another thing he talked about was playgrounds persist. There's no way to beat them. They're just there to run around. There's no linear path through it. It's just something to do. You can look at it and attack it from many different angles. You can be up here and it's a different experience than down here. Everything is valid. Everything's okay. With sandboxes, you kind of like need toys to be in the sandbox to have fun. But with a playground, the playground is the toy. And so the argument that Andrew's making is that your environment and your level design can be the thing that's fun. You can design it in such a way where there can be that you might need to do skill checks to get into advanced areas. Just like at a playground, there's certain areas that the little kids go on, and there's certain areas that the big kids can get to. Like for instance, in the example that's in front of us here, you have those rooftops. Like you're probably not going to want like a 3-year-old kid up on those rooftops, but some of the older kids, like the 11-year-olds, could get up there and maybe they could jump down and jump from one thing to another. I'm not saying that kids should go do this at playgrounds, but you can imagine it in a digital space. There's going to be advanced user tactics essentially. Playgrounds are a place to be, not something to get through, and your level can be like that. I like that because as a level designer, I like being in spaces. But at the end of the day, for a single player level, you usually have to leave the space. I could see that you could make something a space that's fun to be in as something maybe that you have to defend. Maybe in this environment that's in front of us, it's not a multiplayer game. Maybe it's King of the Hill, or maybe the flat gray grid on the floor is lava, and you're in this, or maybe it's like some weird rafted ships next to each other and you have to avoid pirates from boarding or something like that. So I could see how you could do something like this in a single player game, and ultimately as you play it you become more appreciative and respectful of the space. So Andrew did the first part of that talk, and then Jerry Belich did the second part, and his talk was on real world level design. He was talking about in Disneyland, for instance, like Disneyland, every little bit of thing that you see in Disneyland is all very carefully designed to be revealing the way that it is. Like for instance, they don't want you to see the castle until you get it perfectly framed. Berms is a term that he created, or maybe he didn't create it, but he's using to control the reveal of attracting landmarks. Landmarks that attract a player, like maybe your level might have a volcano in it. Maybe you want to frame that volcano in a way that helps drive the player in a direction. You would use berms or other buildings, landscape, things to kind of block the view of that volcano, so that when you're in the right area, that volcano is perfectly in frame. There's no wrong path to the landmark. For instance, if you're trying to get to the castle, or if you're trying to get to the volcano, or if you're trying to get to in Half-Life, there was that tower. I forget the name of it. It's been so long since I played it. But there's that giant tower that you're seeing forever. And at first it's like far away, and then it gets closer and it gets closer. There's no wrong path to a landmark. There's just your path. And that speaks to something that's been talked about before called the player's narrative, which is you, the player, your narrative, your story when playing this game. Not the designer's story for the character that you're playing this game. So there's two different narratives there. There's the designed one by the game developers, and then there's your experience, your narrative as the player, which is also an important narrative to design for and to allow to happen. Not to keep mentioning Astroneer, but that game's all player narrative. There's no story there. It's like, yep, you're on a planet, figure it out. Everything that happens in there is my story. Which is really cool. On Wednesday, I went to a cool talk with Miriam Ballard talking about Grand Theft Auto. She is the art director at Rockstar North on Grand Theft Auto 5 and all of the DLC. Her talk was called Environment Design as Spatial Cinematography. Oh, that's what Moscone Center looks like. This is from the new Moscone Center, and that's Yerba Buena Gardens over there. I went to a Unity breakfast right over in this little window there. There's a really good Japanese place right down here. But yeah, I just want to take a picture of it and go out on the balcony because I had never been out there before, so it was kind of cool. Brand new building. Oh, there's our booth. Oh, I know I took a picture of Miriam. So let me back up a little bit. Let's just talk about Wednesday. So Wednesday was also the day the expo opened. The expo's really cool. It's a really cool place to see what wares people have. There's lots of software that's being shown. We, Academy of Art University, have our own booth. This is Michael Buffington. He is our concept art lead, and we had a series of artist sessions in our booth, and we have a display here, and we have a couple little benches here. And so we had lots of potential students coming up, people who wanted to work with us and collaborate. But it was really cool just to be able to show off. We're also looking at industry pros coming by, taking a look at what our students can make. What you can't see is on the other side of this board is we have some kiosks set up. Those kiosks have student-made games. There's even an online student who made a game that's on there. So that's something that every GDC we put that stuff up so that industry pros can come check it out and see what we're doing. Substance has a booth. If you're a 3D modeler and you don't know Substance, get it. It's free. You can use it. It's really important in terms of like the art pipeline. There's Substance Designer and Substance Painter. Painter's really cool because you can pop in 3D models and paint on them. Maybe someday you can do it in VR where you could just have the mask on and paint it. Someday. This was something that was interesting. It's like a little belt deal that you wear, and it just controls your character on a screen. This was Amazon's thing here. They're doing a lot with games. They bought a portion, or they I don't know how they did it, but they got a chunk of Crytek or the CryEngine, and they're using it as Amazon Lumberyard. So Amazon Lumberyard is basically a CryEngine, although now Amazon's they took a branch of that and they're doing something different with it. But they have a lot of back-end stuff and sales stuff built into Lumberyard, and that's kind of the tech that they've been selling. This is the PlayStation booth. They are showing off a bunch of games here and a bunch of tools to make games. Not necessarily game engines, but more on the firmware and on the hardware side. Here is the Unreal booth in the background. And in the foreground here, this is a giant... I don't know what to call it, but it's like the Fortnite area, I guess. It's got AstroTurf and couches and a bunch of Unreal games. There's a llama right here. You can see the llama. It's a little dark, sorry. There's a llama there that you can ride, and I guess you get a prize if you ride it and don't get thrown off, or if you can stay on 8 seconds. It's a mechanical bull, basically. And then there's a ton of t-shirts, which are awesome. I really like that. And then there's they have a bunch of beer and cookies and popcorn. So of course it attracts tons of game developers, because who doesn't like beer, popcorn, and cookies? In the Unreal booth proper, there was an upstairs area, which I'll show you a video from later, where we had some meetings with the Unreal guys. We have a pretty close relationship with Unity and Unreal, and so they invited us up, and we talked a little bit about what we want to do with our program and ways that they can help us. They also had some demos going on in their main booth here. This was the Unity booth. There was a giant line for t-shirts that I didn't go in, but they're showing on. They had an answer bar where developers could come up and ask questions, and they had the pros there just talking about how they're just answering questions, kind of like Apple's Genius Bar. More stuff with Unity. It looks like Unity's also going into enterprise stuff, doing stuff with film. That kind of thing. You're going to see a lot more of that in the next few years. It's already happening, but you're just going to see it more and more. This was a Unity demo booth where it was huge, and they were just showing off what they were just showing off tools and tutorials and that kind of thing. If you notice, Unity's booth is right next to Unreal's booth, which reminded me of an E3 where PlayStation was right next to Xbox. You had one wall of Xbox and one wall of PlayStation. It was kind of cool. Here's another angle of the Unreal booth. They're showing off the tools in this main booth area. Stadia was another big announcement this year for GDC, and my take on it, it's basically streaming. They stream games to you. My take on it is I didn't think it was going to work, and I don't think it will if you have really low bandwidth. But if you have, if you can stream Netflix, you should be able to stream video games. And the way that they do it is they're not actually, all of the game computation stuff happens on their servers. And the only thing that you're sending out is you are sending out button inputs, which is it's a very small amount of data that you're sending out. And what's coming back is just an image, just like you would stream a Netflix thing. So we'll see more about that. I believe Netflix is also going to be getting into the interactive space as well. So you're probably going to see some competition between Google and Google, who's releasing Stadia, as well as Netflix in the near future. Okay, so to go back to the talks, so that was my Wednesday morning at the expo, and then in the afternoon I went to a talk from Miriam Ballard, who is the art director for Rockstar North, and her talk again was on environment design as spatial cinematography. What does she mean by that? So I'm going to go through the notes that I wrote down, and then I will come back and explain my take on it. Previs modules, most concept is all worked out in 3D. They don't do a whole lot of 2D concept work. The art department starts all the 3D map. Not every company does that, but that's how they work. They compose 3D scenes for 2D. Since we're looking at it on a monitor, which is flat, it's essentially we're still looking at it in 2D, even though it's a 3D environment. For aesthetics and functionality. So composing those 2D, the composing in 3D for 2D. Viz dev from the perspective of the player for pre-visualization. So some concept art you'll find where concept artists will, do a shot from way back, from way far away. They won't do it like from the perspective of the player or from the perspective of the player camera. And I think it's important, and it's kind of echoed here, that there's more concept that's from that player perspective, because that you're just getting closer to the rub faster. Frame and compose the scene for the player when they are in specific spots. One thing that they do too, so they'll compose, like this shot that we're looking at here, it's very well composed in terms of like the angles and kind of where everything's falling. If you think about the rule of thirds, they took it one step further, and what they would do is they would actually put a rule of thirds mask on the game camera and then run around the environment to kind of make sure that everything from every different angle dynamically is being composed for 2D, so that those rule of thirds markers kind of hit the lines wherever the player is moving around. And so they're not just designing like for one shot or another shot. They, especially with multiplayer GTA, it needs to look good from all angles. Avoiding tangents in the foreground and background lines that overlap in the 2D. So essentially what that would mean, let me see if I can get an example here. All right, I'm going to use my phone. So let's say you have, I'm going to compose this for my shot here. Let's say you have this that's right here. It's just like my notebook. And then you have something else that's closer in the foreground, but the tangents are lining up too closely. You can't really tell the depth of the foreground object, or if you have them like this. You can't, it doesn't necessarily read very well to have the foreground object. And we're talking about the line of these two objects right next to my microphone there, how that the line of them is perfectly tangential. So you'd want to offset them a little bit, one or the other, so those objects read more clearly in the foreground and in the background or the midground. So that's something that they take into account as well. Using layers to create depth with foreground objects, midground objects, and background objects, so that anytime the player's looking at the scene, there's a sense of depth and there's a sense of pulling them in there. You don't want everything to be in the foreground, nor do you want everything to be in the background. You want a variety as it kind of goes out, because that's what real world is like with us, unless we're in like an empty parking lot or something. But you can see in this image, there's stuff in the foreground, there's stuff in the midground, and there's stuff in the background to kind of look at. It's visually interesting. It creates that depth. Round shapes give the player a sense of safety and comfort, and jagged shapes instill danger and kind of alertness or uneasiness with the player. Vertical and horizontal lines create power and control. One thing that kind of is contradictory to something that I've thought for a while is using light to lead the player. You should not always use the light to lead the player. It might be that light helps with the framing and the lines and the composition so that other framing can help lead the player. And that was my takeaway from that. In my level design class, I do talk about light leading the player, but it's not just like a light is, leading the player off into the distance. It's like a light is, you might have a doorway that's cracked and there's a light on the other side of it. That's a really hard example. Another example is like you have a crack in a wall and sunlight's pouring through, and then that sunlight is kind of lighting up this hallway a little bit, kind of indicating that that's the direction that you should go. But she's saying that it shouldn't always be used like that.